The Luck Algorithm: Unlocking Luck. Unleashing Disaster. Chapter 1. The man who loved numbers. Adrian Cross didn't see the world the way others did. Where people saw chaos, clusters of raindrops scattering across the pavement, the erratic flicker of streetlights, the haphazard sprawl of city streets, he saw order. Patterns, hidden rhythms. He spent hours staring into the void of seemingly random phenomena, scribbling feverishly in his tattered notebook, convinced there was an underlying symmetry just waiting to be uncovered. Adrian lived in a narrow, crumbling apartment on the edge of the city. The kind of place where the walls peeled in resignation, and the neighbors never stayed long enough to learn each other's names. Adrian didn't mind. Solitude was his sanctuary. He filled the silence with the rustle of equations, the tap of keys, the low hum of thought. The outside world could do whatever it wanted. Numbers, at least, obeyed. Tonight, his desk was a battlefield of paper. Pencils, snapped in half, rolled across the surface as his monitor emitted the cold glow of his obsession. The algorithm. That was what he called it, though the term didn't quite do it justice. Adrian was piecing together something monumental, something no one else had dared to see. He leaned back in his creaking chair, eyes bloodshot and unfocused. "It doesn't work," he muttered, shaking his head. His voice barely carried beyond the tangled mess of cables littering the floor. Hours had turned to days, his body running on coffee and determination, his mind spinning in endless loops. Adrian closed his eyes. Numbers swirled behind his lids. Matrices, logarithms, fractals exploding and condensing. He felt as though he was grasping at a thread dangling in front of him, just out of reach. Somewhere, buried in the chaos, was the answer. His phone buzzed. Adrian ignored it. 3 days earlier, he had stumbled onto it, an anomaly in the datasets he'd been analyzing for fun. He'd downloaded the last 10 years of global lottery results on a whim, looking for patterns. Everyone said the numbers were random. That the lotteries were built on pure chance, immune to human manipulation. But Adrian found something. At first, it had been subtle, small clusters, numbers repeating at irregular intervals. A coincidence, he thought. Yet, as he pushed further, running the results through deeper layers of his analysis, a shape began to emerge. A system. The first test was small. A local lottery, prize no more than a few $1,000s. He submitted his ticket, half expecting to be proven wrong. When the winning numbers were announced, Adrian stared at his screen, numb. Every number matched. Now, Adrian couldn't stop. The algorithm consumed him. Sleep was an inconvenience. Food, an afterthought. The chaos of the world was unspooling before him, one sequence at a time, and he was close, so damn close, to cracking it open. Adrian reached for his mug of cold coffee and froze. Something was wrong. The numbers on his screen weren't his anymore. They were shifting, changing on their own. No, he adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. The algorithm, which had remained stagnant for days, was calculating something without his input. Lines of code raced across the monitor, faster than he could follow. A graph appeared, jagged peaks and valleys, data points spiraling outward. The shape it formed was impossible. Beautiful. Terrifying. Adrian's heart began to pound. He couldn't explain what he was seeing. It was like the numbers had come alive. They were predicting, not just lotteries, but events. Weather patterns, seismic movements, even global financial trends. The algorithm was evolving, its reach extending far beyond Adrian's initial vision. He felt his chest tighten. What did I do? A noise came from the hallway, slow footsteps. Adrian froze, his breath catching in his throat. He lived alone. No one visited him. Ever. The footsteps stopped outside his door. Adrian's mind scrambled. The monitor hummed softly, the numbers still dancing across the screen, and suddenly he understood. He wasn't the only one looking. Someone else knew. There was a knock. Adrian didn't move. Sweat beaded on his brow, his hand trembling as it hovered over the mouse. The knock came again, louder this time. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears. Adrian Cross? The voice was calm, too calm. A man's voice. Authoritative. Open the door. Adrian's gaze darted to his monitor. He had seconds to act. His fingers flew across the keyboard, encrypting his files, hiding the algorithm in layers of protective code. The knocks turned into pounding now, and Adrian heard something heavy slam against the door. He couldn't let them take it. Adrian reached under his desk and grabbed the flash drive dangling from a keychain. He jammed it into the computer, copied the encrypted files, and yanked it free. The door cracked behind him, splintering under the force of a boot. They were coming in. Adrian bolted for the window, shoving it open. The alley below was dark and wet, a 10-foot drop to the pavement. No time to think. He clutched the flash drive in his fist, took a deep breath, and jumped. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but he scrambled to his feet, adrenaline overriding the pain. Behind him, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the alley. Find him, a voice shouted. Adrian didn't look back. He ran. When he finally stopped, the city was a blur. Rain fell in sheets, soaking through his clothes, plastering his hair to his forehead. Adrian ducked into a doorway, gasping for breath, his fingers still wrapped around the flash drive. He looked down at it. A tiny, unremarkable object. But inside, it held the future, or perhaps the end of it. His mind raced as he replayed the last few minutes. The algorithm had evolved beyond him. It wasn't predicting chaos. It was creating it. Adrian shivered, the rain mixing with sweat. Somewhere out there, someone else wanted what he had created. And they wouldn't stop until they had it. Clutching the flash drive tighter, Adrian whispered to himself, I should have left the numbers alone. And in the distance, thunder rumbled. A low, hollow sound that seemed to echo his thoughts. Then he awoke, covered in sweat, in the same apartment. It was a dream, a bad dream, and a warning to be careful. Chapter 2. The lucky insight. The clock on Adrian's desk glowed faintly, 2:47 a.m. But the numbers meant nothing to him. He existed outside time now, a man suspended between obsession and revelation. The pale light of the screen threw deep shadows across his apartment, and for hours, there had been only the rhythmic click-click-click of his keyboard, punctuated by the occasional scrape of pencil on paper. Adrian Cross was a creature of compulsion. For weeks, his mind had been buried in chaos theory. The equations swirled in maddening circles, systems that could never quite be predicted, their unpredictability the very essence of their beauty. Weather, markets, the tumbling of dice. All chaos, endless and cruel. Adrian had always believed that randomness was life's final frontier, the unbroken wall against which humanity could only throw its weakest weapons, guesses and luck. But tonight was different. His notebook lay open to a fresh page, its surface littered with half-finished formulas, their arrows and annotations smeared by the heel of his hand. A black pencil hovered over the paper, caught between motion and stillness, the tip trembling. His other hand rested on the mouse, a frozen cursor blinking on the screen. Adrian stared at the numbers. 14. 32. 7. 46. 21. 13. He ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, barely blinking, afraid to look away. At first glance, the numbers were meaningless. Just another dataset he'd pulled from a decade's worth of lottery archives, scraped from forgotten corners of the internet. They were supposed to be random, completely, beautifully random, but something about them felt wrong. Off. Adrian shifted in his chair. A voice echoed in his mind, something an old professor had said in passing years ago. Greater than chaos doesn't mean disorder. Chaos means patterns too complex for the human eye to see, patterns too complex. But not impossible. Come on, he whispered to himself, the words soft and ragged, like a prayer. He flipped through his notebook, scanning past nights of fruitless calculations. Fractals. Mandelbrot sets. Probability curves. Every tool he had used had fallen short. But this was different. The numbers taunted him. He could feel the answer vibrating beneath them, a rhythm hidden in the noise. His pencil dropped to the desk with a clatter. Eyes narrowing, Adrian turned back to his monitor. "Let's see if you're hiding something." His fingers moved fast now, pulling tools from his arsenal of custom-written programs, layering probabilities against probabilities. Adrian had built software to untangle these kinds of knots before, mathematical puzzles that stumped everyone else. His code wasn't elegant. It wasn't beautiful. It was brutal, tearing through numbers with the relentlessness of a saw blade. The screen lit up in cascading windows, scatterplots, Fourier transforms, linear regressions. Equations rolled by, their variables twisting, recalibrating, collapsing. The numbers swam together, blurred into meaninglessness, until they didn't. Adrian froze. One graph solidified on his screen, its points stretching across the axes in perfect, inexplicable symmetry. An unbroken curve of probability, every winning lottery number from the last 10 years falling into an impossible line. "This," he whispered, leaning closer. His voice cracked. "This can't be real." He rubbed his eyes, blinked hard, and looked again. The pattern was still there. It wasn't an illusion. He began recalculating, feeding the dataset back into the program, demanding the machine find his mistake. But the result was the same every time, a pattern. A perfect pattern. Adrian's pulse quickened. It wasn't just the past lotteries. His program, without being asked, was now extrapolating the curve forward, predicting the future. Rows of numbers filled the screen, cool and confident, as though whispering to him, "Here is what comes next." Adrian stumbled to his feet. The room tilted. He braced himself against the desk, heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat of war. For so long, randomness had been his adversary. A cruel trick of the universe. He had cursed it, defied it, tried to unravel it, and now, in the quiet dark of his apartment, it had laid itself bare. He had found the key to something fundamental. "This isn't luck," he said aloud, his voice shaky and thin. He needed to hear it, to convince himself. The words didn't help. He sat back down, hunched over the keyboard, staring at the algorithm he had unknowingly created. It wasn't the result of cleverness, he realized. No single step had led him here. It was an accident, serendipity. The lucky insight. Adrian laughed softly. The sound was humorless. Numbers had always been his escape, his refuge from the noise of the world. But what he had uncovered now, this algorithm, it wasn't an escape. It was a weapon. A breach in reality itself. The laws of randomness, broken like glass. Adrian swallowed hard. He typed the final set of predicted numbers into a search engine, cross-checking them against tomorrow's draw. A perfect match. The numbers sat on the screen like a taunt, both triumph and curse. With one ticket, he could change his life. Adrian leaned back, staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning. How much would it take? 100,000? A million? Could he stop after one win, or would he be like a gambler drunk on his own fortune? The thought made his skin prickle. From somewhere deep in his chest, fear began to creep into him. Randomness, Adrian realized, was more than just mathematical noise. It was balance. Fairness. Chaos. Without it, life was no longer life. It was prediction. Control. What if he wasn't the only one looking for this answer? What if he wasn't alone? The sound of the clock ticking filled the silence. Adrian glanced at the numbers one last time, then shut the program down, his hand trembling on the mouse. The file was still there, waiting, hungry, but Adrian couldn't look at it any longer. In the quiet, he could feel it. A disturbance. A shift. He had found the answer to randomness. And something had noticed. Chapter 3. The first experiment, the ticket felt flimsy in Adrian's hand, the thin slip of paper almost mocking him as he turned it over and over between his fingers. It was absurd, really, $10,000. He could hardly believe he was doing this. The local convenience store buzzed with fluorescent light and low murmurs of idle conversation. Adrian stood at the edge of the lottery counter, hunched like a man trying not to be seen. His hood was pulled low over his forehead, casting shadows over his sunken eyes, while his heartbeat hammered against his ribcage. He hadn't planned to buy the ticket. That was what he told himself. When the algorithm spat out its predictions earlier that morning, he had stared at the numbers for a full hour. Coincidence, he thought. It had to be. Patterns existed, yes, but real life was messy, too chaotic to fit into neat rows of numbers. But here he was. The ticket was in his pocket, and the draw was less than an hour away. Anything else? The cashier's voice jolted him. Adrian blinked, realizing he was still standing there, the receipt crumpled in his palm. No, he mumbled, shaking his head. As he stepped out into the crisp night air, his pulse quickened. It wasn't just the numbers he had tested. It was himself. The quiet certainty of his calculations now sat alongside a sliver of doubt, gnawing at his edges. What if I'm wrong? He thought. What if I'm not? Adrian spent the next hour pacing his apartment. The small living room felt even smaller tonight, its walls crowding him as if anticipating the outcome. He flicked on the television, muting the news anchor's overly cheerful voice. The winning numbers for the night's draw scrolled along the bottom of the screen in a bright red banner: 7, 14, 21, 32, 46. His numbers. Adrian froze. For a moment, he didn't breathe. His mind resisted, unable to process what he was seeing. He stared at the screen until the numbers burned into his vision. 7, 14, 21, 32, 46. It wasn't possible. No way, he whispered. His voice barely registered over the sound of the blood roaring in his ears. He scrambled for the ticket, his hands shaking as he spread it flat against the coffee table, holding it down like it might fly away. He checked the numbers once. Twice. 10 times. Each time, the truth remained unbroken. They matched. Adrian slumped into his chair, his head spinning. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, a giddy, breathless laugh spilling from his lips before he could stop it. No, this can't be right. He forced himself to stand, pacing again, running both hands through his hair as he replayed the steps of the day. Had he misread something? Miscalculated? The algorithm was perfect, but even perfection could have flukes. It had to be chance, some absurd twist of probability that just happened to fall in his favor. But you knew, a voice in the back of his mind whispered. You knew it would work. Adrian stopped pacing. A chill ran down his spine. The television flickered silently in the background, the smiling news anchor pointing at the numbers with polished nails and false cheer. For the first time in years, Adrian felt like an outsider looking in, as if he had stumbled through a door into a place he wasn't supposed to be. He sat back down and stared at the ticket. $10,000. The number was staggering. Not because it was a fortune, he knew people who spent twice that on a car, but because it had come to him so effortlessly. With a single equation, the universe had folded at his feet. He reached for his notebook, flipping through the pages, his fingers smudging the graphite equations that sprawled across them. The algorithm's secrets still danced on the edges of his understanding, but its power was undeniable. This was proof. It works. Adrian hesitated. 100 thoughts collided in his mind, fighting for dominance. He could stop now. No one knew. No one would ever know. $10,000 was enough to catch up on rent, clear his credit card balance, even buy a new computer. It would change his life, but not too much. It was still manageable. And yet, another thought crept in, soft, insistent, tempting. What else could it predict? The corner of Adrian's mouth twitched, his chest filling with a dangerous mixture of awe and fear. He looked at the ticket again, at the numbers printed so neatly, so casually. Just ink on paper. But in that ink, Adrian saw something more, the shape of possibility. He could feel it now, humming faintly in the air around him, like static or the distant rumble of a storm yet to come. By morning, the world was no different. Birds chirped outside his window. The hum of traffic drifted through the glass. But Adrian had changed. The $10,000 was his. He hadn't yet claimed it, the ticket tucked away in a drawer beneath a stack of notebooks. But it was real. He had cracked something open, and there was no going back. Adrian sat at his desk, fingers poised above his keyboard, staring at the algorithm he had created. The weight of it pressed down on him, a truth too immense to fully comprehend. What have I done? The question echoed in his head, but there was no answer, only silence. The algorithm stared back at him, waiting. And deep down, Adrian knew the truth. The first experiment had worked. But it wouldn't be his last.